The following video is designed to be unflaggable even by YouTube standards, which of course is impossible. It's concerning early computer science and the goofiness people used to deal with when it came to computers and the nearly mythical status of some of the goofy things they had to deal with. MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab, 0.2 megahertz, 1,300-pound, 1964 era PDP 6 computer system. This is a piece of equipment, if you're not aware of it, that could have up to a megabyte of RAM or something like that, but it usually started off much smaller. It's a very early computer that could do a lot of neat things, but it weighed a huge amount, and it was not based on what you and I would refer to as microchips. Anyway, in this huge array of equipment, the leftmost bay has a story to it. Metal body Honeywell switch that's depicted on the left side here. It was mounted to an aluminum plate using presumably steel or aluminum hardware, probably some steel. And that this mounting plate was then mounted to the body of the PDP-6 or some rack mount equipment near it, using this metal plate held in with a standoff that was held in with a set of screws. It could be aluminum washer and a steel screw, or aluminum only. You get the idea. This was further hot glued to keep it from rattling or moving or something. And there you can see what it was done with. Now, if you're not aware of this, I'm just going to quickly go over it. The center pin of this wired switch goes to what would be ostensibly the ground. And this other wire, when the switch was in a particular position, would connect to here. And whatever was on this end would be taken from whatever voltage level it had. Presumably there was a pull-up resistor, so it'd be 5 volts or whatever, and pulled down to ground or 0 volts, or the equivalent thereof. This switch was marked magic for that position when those two wires are connected to each other to turn on and or enable a new function that was added on to the PDP-6. This was installed by Tom Knight for this now forgotten magic mode that even he can't remember exactly what it was. Now, that equipment eventually was removed, and that switch and the bracket and the two standoffs and the 2 screws and presumably 2 washers was left behind. Somebody came along like a smartass with a pencil and wrote more magic for the other position, not knowing what it was and feeling like putting a little joke in place, which is very common with early homebrew / hacker culture. Thus, we are left with a 2-inch piece of wire connected to the outer pin, right here, soldered reasonably well, and a 4-inch wire on the center pin that proceeded to wrap around that standoff that was holding the mount plate in place, and then be screwed itself to the body of the frame or whatever, and that was acting as a ground. And then they hot glued it to keep it from rattling or moving as much. You may have noticed up here that the hot glue appears to be filling the hole, so this one wasn't actually screwed down. So all of this, including the switch plate, was quote-unquote, we're going to call it quote-unquote mounted, in quotes, by one screw, a standoff, another screw, presumably a washer. Was it a lock washer? And then to that plate was mounted a switch, which has its own metal parts, and that was used to switch on and off whether or not this wire was wired to ground. But in one position after cutting these loose, you have a grounded wire, a long one, equivalent, or you have a grounded wire and a shorter one. A 2-inch and 4-inch wire, only one of which is grounded, the other one floating, attached to the switch. If you flip the switch or touch the mounting plate, the PDP would crash. So this was all cut out with a diagonal cutters called diking out in 1979, February 19th, and was witnessed by several people there because they had a habit of documenting everything because, you know, military, ex-military people or whatever, or maybe they're just doing cover their ass. Now, this is the analysis part of it. Why would this cause a crash if you touched the plate, maybe wiggled it, or flipped the switch? Okay, we're talking 1970s computer circuits that were quote-unquote digital circuits. Now, if you're not aware of why I'm saying quote, they weren't truly digital. Number one, they were basically transistor logic, which would use a forced feedback loop, if you were lucky, to force it to be as close to truly digital as possible. Switches, mechanical parts, reality is not digital. Flipping a switch produces a ridiculous amount of noises all the way up and down the spectrum, even if you don't apply power to it. Hint, hint. Next, the fact that this was involving any switching of anything to the ground bus means immediately this would affect the grounding of the system. The original version of the story seemed to talk about it as if it was a really long length of wire. But the total length here is being shown as 6 inches total. Now, obviously, at the other end here, this could have been a wire that went all over hell and damnation to get to some other piece of equipment. So, next to the switch is where a local grounding was done. So, what could this have been? Number one, just manipulating the thing. Could have just shook loose something unrelated to it that was nearby that was wiggling, an intermittent short or an intermittent open. Next, only one part is actually attached to any kind of ground. It's this part, and technically the center pin of the switch is the only part that would be if you were lucky. You could have had all of this stuff not grounded, including the wire, and it would have been that way. The next thing I want to point out is, even though there's almost no possibility of this having any charge in it or any magnetic field, it is very likely that's a steel screw because of the rust appearing on it. And there might have been a steel screw on the other end of this, holding that to the body of the framework of the PDP, which means there would be a steel piece in here. Next, again, it's indicated strongly that this is the entire arrangement of parts, and they just snipped off the wires. But this could have been a very long piece of wire at the time they noticed it doing this magic trick. So, what caused all of that? Nobody knows. Nobody did basic testing. They just wanted to keep the PDP running, and once they noticed a problem would happen when you fiddled with it, they cut it out immediately and made the problem go away. That's it. I also want to point out what could actually have caused this to be a problem. If this was a really long hunk of wire and it went off to somewhere and did not terminate anywhere, again, the way it's told as a story, it's often depicted as being this wire terminating at another ground point. The story has variations to it. And yeah, I don't know which one's correct, but let's say for a moment this wire really did go to some other part of the system. Again, a 1,300 pound computer system could have had ground lines everywhere. And if this was really a ground point, grounding a length of wire, let's say it was 10 feet long, for the hell of it, would absolutely change the grounding condition in the situation. Any of you who play with electric guitars know about ground loop problems where you have grounding wires producing huge amounts of interference noise at 60 hertz or 120 because a ground wire, doesn't matter if something's grounded, there could still be a potential between them. And more importantly, you can find no voltage potential, but find a current potential. There's current flow problems. But let's say it was just this short thing. What could cause the intermittent behavior? Simply manipulating the switch might have just shook the rest of the frame next to the PDP-6 and shook loose something else that was also intermittent they didn't notice. Now, I want to point out, I'm not throwing shade on the people who originally discovered it, but they didn't do all of the steps you're supposed to do to find out what the hell just happened. Because of that, we'll never really know what caused it. So, my interpretation to give an answer so it's plausible, otherwise known as I'm bullshitting. This is me at the bar telling you a long fish story. Here we go. My opinion is that this wire here on the outside edge was a longer wire that went somewhere and hooked up to ground. And as long as this end of the wire wasn't grounded, it had no effect. Or it did have an effect, it didn't matter. But if you changed its state, suddenly that would be a sudden change in the electrical flow in it, magnetic field or whatever, and it would create very, very short duration, loud, electrically higher, quote-unquote, voltage spike in that wire that could have propagated through the grounding if it wasn't perfect, None of it ever is, and that might have caused this. Now let's discuss how to make this impossible later. If this center pin here is supposed to be grounded, the way you're supposed to ground it is to run a wire through it. One wire goes over the bare exposed case and connects onto a soldered-on lug right there. That's what it's for. That's actually a ground lug in many cases. Actually, it's not. It's for keeping it from rotating, but you can use it as a ground lug. Put a loop or ground on it that is solderable. So it's soldered to this plate. So the plate becomes grounded there. And then run another wire, yes, this is the best way, down to the frame of it with its own independent screw and its own independent screw eye, the little ring, so it's grounded perfectly. Make sure it's abrasively done. Then hot glue it shut, and then you go ahead and screw the plate on. But you'll have to screw on both ends. Otherwise, every time you switch the plate, it's putting torque on it and unscrewing the plate. You never do that. And the next thing is, if you're using aluminum parts and you're using digital equipment, do not use steel screws because chemically they're different and it will create a potential due to chemical reactions. It'll act like a little battery, number one. Number two, it's just bad form. And the next thing is, if you have these things mounted that way, just put a mount plate that's designed for it to go onto the framework and use that instead. And again, ground it to here and ground it to the frame, or, like I just said, just take the switch, drill a hole in the framework for the PDP-6 and be done with it, and then run the ground wire to it, and then run that other wire where we want to. Or don't do any of this and not have the problem in the way. But anyway, interesting and or fun story. Lots of Ouija board stuff here going on. And again, this is caused by the fact that, if you're not aware of it, in the 1970s, digital electronics was just really analog equipment imitating digital. Therefore, it was susceptible to lots of noise because analog equipment is supposed to accept noise because that's data in an analog system. True digital systems are supposed to completely reject any noise, only allowing in two states, on and off. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that, and I'm happy I got a picture of what they were talking about in the story. And no, it doesn't clear it up any more than it did before. Bye.